Have you ever noticed something so small that you almost dismissed it, but then couldn't stop thinking about it? Something that doesn't make sense until you realize the only explanation is impossible? That's what happened to me, and it took me weeks to accept the truth about what was happening in my apartment while I slept. My name is Jason, and I live alone in the studio apartment in Austin, Texas. The apartment is small, maybe 450 square feet. It's a converted loft in an older building downtown. High ceilings. Exposed brick. A bathroom that's basically a closet with a toilet. The kind of place that young professionals rent when they want to feel like they're living in the city but don't have a lot of money. I've lived there for 3 years. I like it. It's quiet. It's relatively safe. It's mine. And until about 6 weeks ago, I thought I knew everything that happened within those 4 walls. I work as a software engineer. I go to work around 8 in the morning. I come home around 6 in the evening. I'm gone for about 10 hours every day. My routine is predictable. I wake up. I shower. I brush my teeth. I eat breakfast. I go to work. I come home. I eat dinner. I do some work on personal projects. I go to bed around 11. It's a standard life. Nothing dramatic. Nothing unusual. It's the kind of life where you don't expect anything weird to happen. It's the kind of life where you assume that when you're gone, and your apartment stays exactly the way you left it. About 6 weeks ago, I noticed something odd one morning. My toothbrush was wet. I had brushed my teeth the night before, as I always do. I had rinsed the toothbrush, and I had left it in the cup by the sink, bristles down, in the holder where it always sits. The bristles had been dry when I went to bed, but when I woke up the next morning and I went to brush my teeth, the bristles were wet, soaking wet, like they had been rinsed under running water. I thought it was strange, but I rationalized it immediately. Maybe I had rinsed it again before bed and I had forgotten. Maybe the humidity in the bathroom had made it feel wet when it was actually just damp. Maybe I was misremembering how dry it had been. I didn't think about it much. I brushed my teeth with the wet toothbrush and went about my day. But the next morning, the same thing happened. My toothbrush was wet again. The bristles were dripping wet. Not damp, soaking wet, like someone had rinsed it under a faucet minutes before. This time I couldn't rationalize it as easily. I knew I hadn't rinsed it again. I knew I hadn't forgotten about rinsing it. I knew that my toothbrush was dry when I went to bed and wet when I woke up. Something didn't make sense, but I told myself that there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe there was a leak in the building. Maybe water was dripping from somewhere. Maybe there was a humidity issue. I didn't want to believe anything else. I decided to pay attention. The next night, before I went to bed, I made sure the toothbrush was completely dry. I dried it with a hand towel. I made sure the bristles were dry to the touch. I put it back in the cup. I went to bed, and the next morning, it was wet again. Soaking wet. Drenched. The bristles were dripping water onto the sink. This time I couldn't rationalize it. This time I had to admit that something was wrong. But what could it be? I was the only person with a key to my apartment. The door was locked every night. The windows were closed. How could my toothbrush be getting wet? I started checking other things. I looked around the bathroom for signs of water damage. I looked at the ceiling for leaks. I looked at the walls for moisture. Everything was dry. The floor was dry. There was no sign of water anywhere except on my toothbrush. I checked the sink. The faucet wasn't leaking. I checked the toilet. It was fine. I checked the shower. Everything was normal. But my toothbrush kept getting wet. This went on for 3 days. Every morning, my toothbrush was soaking wet. Every morning, I had no explanation for it. I started to feel paranoid. I started to feel like something was wrong in my apartment. Something was happening while I slept. Something was in my apartment. I didn't want to believe it, but I was running out of rational explanations. I decided to do something about it. I decided to set a trap. I put my toothbrush in a different location. I moved it from the cup by the sink to the medicine cabinet. The medicine cabinet is above the sink, accessible only by opening the cabinet door. I made sure the toothbrush was completely dry. I left a small piece of tape on the cabinet door so I would know if someone opened it. I went to bed. And the next morning, my toothbrush was wet again, and the tape was still on the door. I felt my stomach drop. I felt a surge of panic. The cabinet door had not been opened, but my toothbrush was wet. That was impossible. That meant the water was getting to the toothbrush somehow, without anyone opening the cabinet. That meant there was water in the cabinet. That meant there was a leak somewhere that I couldn't see. I opened the cabinet, and I looked at everything inside. I looked at the shelves. I looked at the back wall. Everything was dry. There was no water. There was no leak. But my toothbrush was soaking wet. I decided to move the toothbrush was soaking wet. I decided to move the toothbrush again. I moved it to my bedroom. I put it on my nightstand. I made sure it was completely dry. I went to bed. And the next morning, my toothbrush was wet again. Soaking wet. It had been in my closed bedroom all night, and it was wet. That meant either there was water leaking into my bedroom, or someone was coming into my bedroom and wetting my toothbrush. Neither option made sense. Both options were terrifying. I called my landlord. I told him that I suspected there was a water leak in my apartment. I told him about the wet toothbrush. He thought I was crazy. He came over and checked the apartment. He looked at the plumbing. He looked at the ceiling. He looked for signs of moisture or damage. He found nothing. He told me that there was no leak. He told me that the apartment was fine. He told me that maybe I was just being paranoid. He left, and I was alone with the knowledge that my toothbrush was still getting wet, and there was no explanation for it. I started thinking about the only other possibility. Someone was getting into my apartment. Someone was coming in while I was asleep and wetting my toothbrush. It was the only explanation that made sense. But how? How could someone get into a locked apartment? How could they get past me? How could they wet my toothbrush without me knowing? I had a security system. It wasn't connected to monitoring, but it had a door sensor. If someone opened the door, it would make a sound. I hadn't heard the alarm. But maybe I was sleeping too deeply. Maybe they were quiet enough that the alarm sound didn't wake me. I decided to buy a camera. I bought a small security camera, and I placed it in my bedroom, pointed at my nightstand where my toothbrush was. I positioned it so it would record everything that happened in the room while I slept. I set it up. I tested it. Everything worked. I put my toothbrush on the nightstand. I made sure it was dry. I went to bed. I was going to find out what was happening. The next morning, I immediately checked the camera. I looked at the footage from the night before. I watched the entire 8 hours of footage on fast forward, and I saw nothing. I saw myself sleeping. I saw the room staying exactly the same. I didn't see anyone entering the room. I didn't see anyone approaching my nightstand. I didn't see anyone touching my toothbrush. And yet when I looked at the nightstand, my toothbrush was soaking wet. The camera had recorded nothing, but the toothbrush was wet. I felt like I was losing my mind. I felt like I was in a horror movie where the laws of physics didn't apply. I felt like something impossible was happening, and I couldn't understand it. I decided to try something different. I decided to stay awake. I decided to watch my toothbrush all night and see if I could figure out what was happening. That night I put my toothbrush on my nightstand. I made sure it was completely dry. I turned off the lights and I lay in bed and I stared at the toothbrush. I stared at it for hours. I didn't sleep. I just watched, and nothing happened. The toothbrush sat on my nightstand. It didn't move. No one came near it. The night passed. The sun came up, and my toothbrush was completely dry. It was the first morning in weeks that my toothbrush was dry. I realized something in that moment. The toothbrush only got wet when I was asleep. The toothbrush only got wet when I wasn't watching. The moment I stayed awake, the moment I was conscious and aware, the toothbrush stayed dry. That realization was somehow more terrifying than finding out someone was getting into my apartment, because it meant that either someone was so attuned to my sleep patterns that they could tell when I was asleep and when I wasn't, or it meant something else, something that didn't make sense, something that I didn't want to contemplate. I called the police. I told them what was happening. I told them that my toothbrush was getting wet while I slept and I couldn't explain it. The officer who came to my apartment was skeptical. He asked me the obvious questions. Are you sure you're not wetting it yourself and forgetting? Are you sure there's not a leak? Are you sure someone isn't playing a prank? I answered all of his questions. No, I wasn't wetting it myself. No, there was no leak. No, I didn't have friends who would do this to me. The officer looked at me like I was wasting his time. He didn't take it seriously. He left and told me to call back if something serious happened. But something serious was happening. Something serious was happening in my apartment. Something was getting into my apartment and wetting my toothbrush while I slept. Something was doing it in a way that left no evidence. Something was doing it in a way that I couldn't catch on camera. Something was doing it in a way that was designed to make me question my own sanity. I stopped sleeping in my apartment. I started going to my friend's house after work. I would come home just to check on things, and then I would leave again. I couldn't stay in the apartment. I couldn't sleep there. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about what was happening while I slept. I thought about what was in my apartment. I thought about what was touching my toothbrush. After about a week of staying at my friend's house, I went back to my apartment to get some things. I walked into the bathroom and I found my toothbrush in the cup by the sink. It was in a different position than I had left it, and it was wet. Soaking wet. Someone had been in my apartment. Someone had gone into my bathroom and moved my toothbrush and wet it. Someone had done this while I wasn't there. Someone had been in my apartment while I was gone during the day. I called the police again. This time I had evidence. This time I could tell them that someone had moved my toothbrush and someone had been in my apartment while I wasn't there. The police came and they looked at the apartment. They found that the lock on my door had been tampered with. The lock was still functional, but there were marks on the mechanism showing that someone had picked it or forced it. The police told me that I had been burglarized. They told me that someone had broken into my apartment. They opened an investigation, but nothing had been stolen. My laptop was still there. My television was still there. My wallet was still there. The only thing that was disturbed was my toothbrush. The only thing that showed signs of tampering was my toothbrush. Why would someone break into my apartment just to wet my toothbrush? Why would someone risk breaking and entering just to move my toothbrush and wet it? It didn't make sense. The police investigated for weeks. They looked at security footage from the building. They looked at the lock. They interviewed other residents. And they found something. There was someone. A man who had been seen entering the building multiple times. A man who didn't live in the building. A man who had been caught on camera walking past my apartment door. The police were able to trace his movements. The man had been breaking into apartments in the building. He had been targeting specific apartments. And for some reason he had targeted mine. They found him. His name was Marcus. He was 32 years old. He had a history of breaking and entering. He had a history of stalking. The police arrested him and they asked him why he had been breaking into my apartment. Why he had been wetting my toothbrush. He didn't answer. He refused to explain himself. He refused to say why he had been doing it. He just smiled. He smiled while they interrogated him. He smiled while they showed him the evidence. He smiled while they explained what they had found, and he never said a word about why my toothbrush was wet. Marcus was convicted of breaking and entering and stalking. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, but the prosecution could never prove what his intent was. They could never prove that he was planning to do something more. They could never prove that wetting my toothbrush was just the beginning. They could only prove that he had broken in and that he had tampered with my property, and that was enough to get him convicted, but it was never enough to fully explain what was happening. I moved out of that apartment. I moved out of Austin. I moved across the country. I couldn't stay in that place. I couldn't sleep in an apartment knowing that someone had been there while I slept. I couldn't brush my teeth without thinking about the fact that someone had been touching my toothbrush. I couldn't close my eyes at night without feeling like something was wrong. And I still don't fully understand what Marcus was doing. I still don't know why he was breaking into my apartment. I still don't know why he was wetting my toothbrush. I still don't know if he was planning to do something worse. I still don't know if wetting the toothbrush was a test. A way to see if I would notice. A way to see how much he could do to me without me realizing. A way to prepare for something more sinister. What I do know is that someone was in my apartment while I slept. Someone was touching my things. Someone was violating my space. Someone was violating my space. Someone was doing something that was designed to make me question my sanity, and the only way I found out was because my toothbrush was wet. The only warning I had was that small detail. That small, insignificant detail that I almost dismissed. If I had rationalized it away, if I had accepted the logical explanations, if I had told myself that it was just humidity or a leak or my own forgetfulness, I might never have known. I might have woken up one morning to something much worse than a wet toothbrush.